Hello, my name is Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and today I would like to begin by playing the cartoon sound effect game, which is not actually an established game. We're making it up right now. We're just starting this. It's not like a holiday thing where I'm from. I don't know actually the rules. Let's just try it. Okay, what sound does it make in a cartoon when somebody is in the process of tripping over things like a bunch of marbles, or they're running along and they get onto an oil slick or a banana peel, and then they fly up in the air for a second and they don't immediately fall while they're trying to gain their balance? Can you picture that sound? It's like the boogada 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 boogada. It's like the trying to get traction sound. It's something like that, right? Okay, let's keep going. You're surprised at how much you knew that one but it's like, it's real. It's a thing. We all know this. Okay, I got another one. What sound does it make when a cartoon character winds up before they go to run really, really fast, and then they go dashing away with little lines that appear behind them and a puff of smoke to demonstrate how fast they're going? What sound does that make? It makes a pa-choo sound, right? It's like a ricochet from like a .22 if you accidentally hit some metal and it goes flying off to who knows where. I don't know why. That's just the sound it makes when somebody's about to launch into running real fast. Okay, got another one. What sound does it make when there's a skeleton in a cartoon and then it reassembles into a skeleton that can dance around and is reanimated? You got that one? It is obviously some kind of xylophone sound, right? Like high-pitched xylophone noises, like as if the bones were clinking together and coming back together. We just know this stuff. How long has that imagery been in our brain for any of those, but especially for the skeleton one? I think I would have supposed that would be a relatively recent image in our brain of a skeleton reassembling, like one of those toys that has the button on the bottom where you push it and the thing goes limp, but then you let it go and it stiffens all up and it stands back up straight again. But I think it's a very, 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 very old image that goes back to way before the time of Jesus. And I think that image has been there for so long because at some point in life, everybody figures out that people die. And at some point in life, everybody figures out, morbid though it may be, that after you die, stuff happens to your body and it's not in real good shape. And when an animal or even a person dies, you look at them in that moment of death and you're like, but you still seem like you could be okay. But with time, the natural processes of decay make it really clear that like, no, that thing's really, really dead. It ain't coming back to life. That's it. But I think humans of every culture, even cultures that are dominated by atheism at this point in history, I still think every human has this sneaking suspicion that people are more than everything else, that there is something unique about the way we're built and put together. There's something unique about the mind and the soul and the spirit. And death feels very natural, but it also feels very unnatural. Well, in Matthew 27, we get a description of something weird happening. It's very difficult to know what to do with this weird thing historically, other than to say it's in the text and it thematically fits very, very well with what Matthew is talking about, with what Jesus is talking about, and indeed with what the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, is talking about. Here's what I mean. In Matthew 27, it says, "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit." That's verse 50. Then 51, it says, "At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." That's the first of those really dramatic signs. I suppose you could include the darkness in that before Jesus died. But that's the first big, whoa, this is an omen, a sign. It means something. That's the first one that we talked about over the last few days. But then it goes on and there are more signs. The earth shook and the rocks split. And I suppose we could take an entire episode on those two signs as well, but what that would conjure, I think, would be pretty straightforward in people's brains. There are a handful of well-known earthquake-style events, famously the prophet sitting out in the desert trying to hear the voice of God, and the voice of God wasn't in the earthquake, and it wasn't in the fire. It was in this still, small voice demonstrating that God could communicate through gigantic, powerful things, but also through very meek things. Whoa, that same contrast is happening right here with Jesus meekly going to the cross, laying down his rights and dying, but also Now the earth is shaking and all of this bigger stuff is happening. The earth shook and opened up with the fountains of the deep in Noah's flood, demonstrating the theme of God's judgment. When God gave the law at Sinai, the mountain shook. Obviously, God's power and authority over human institutions and the things that make us feel secure in what we've built is on display in the defeat of Jericho as God causes the walls to shake apart just because of music. Amos famously predicted an earthquake that occurred during the Assyrian era and that in a lot of ways validated him as a prophet. And then here in Matthew 27, boom, we get another earthquake, meaning that all of those things and many more that I didn't reference could all be conveyed in this event. I think the contrast between the meekness of the still small voice of God and the power of God to control even the foundations of the earth, as described in 1 Kings 19 with the prophet Elijah who was seeking the voice of God. I think that one thematically is a pretty obvious callback here in what's happening as well. And then obviously, in addition to the earthquake, you have the rocks splitting. Where does that take your head, those of you who've been around the Bible? And for those of you who are newer to this, don't feel bad that you don't know every single one of these stories off the top of your head. I've been doing this forever, and I don't know every single one of these stories off the top of your head. It's a big book written over a very long time. But maybe for some of you, you're thinking, oh, that's like the idea where Moses was wrong in splitting the rock, but God's power still provided living water out in the desert during the Exodus stuff. And maybe in a way, we're getting that same callback here, that we're going from something that is dead and lifeless, like a rock, and out of it might flow this living water, except where Moses got it wrong. Jesus, once again, is the new and greater Moses who passed the test of sin and temptation and not only did the will of God, but did the will of God shrewdly, but also innocently and with a pure heart, getting everything right. But then we come back to the stuff that I was talking about at the beginning with the skeleton xylophone sounds and skeletons reassembling and coming back to life. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died there were raised to life. On a practical level, before we get into this more tomorrow, how dead were they is a question I have always had. Because if we're talking about like the spooky Halloween, Coco, Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos kind of thing, where the ascending arrhythmic xylophone sound happens in the upper register, and the bones reassemble. If we're talking about that, that's pretty crazy. If we're talking about people who were very recently dead, that's also pretty crazy, just visually a little bit differently crazy. And look, we need more time to process all of this stuff, but here's what I want to say, hearkening all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. Obviously, dead people coming back to life is a much more profound omen or message from the divine than an earthquake, than a rock splitting, even than a curtain tearing. This is the big one, and I think there's a reason it appears last in the list. Because the other stuff points to the possibility that the biggest thing that we wonder about, which is our own mortality, might be solved. But then if the last thing on the list is the problem of human mortality being solved, that feels more like the punchline than just another omen or another hint. And part of what I want to look at tomorrow with all of this is some of the things that the original audience would have already had in their brains as a point of context, as a category for thinking about this theologically, because this is not a new idea, even though you'll hear some people say, like, oh, resurrection is a novelty of Christianity and of Jesus. It really isn't. This idea of overcoming death is in the Old Testament, and it's explicitly in the Old Testament in a scene in the book of Ezekiel that directly describes a bunch of bones, xylophone upper register style, reassembling out of the dry ground into living things by the power of God. And it's meant to communicate something, and it feels like this incident that's happening after the crucifixion is a payoff on some really important Old Testament themes like that one, which we're going to tackle tomorrow. Also, tomorrow is the first day that I think I'll have the opportunity to officially introduce you to Samaritan Ministries and to tell you more about that. They're going to be sponsoring the program intermittently here for a few weeks. And as I've mentioned throughout the week, I'm really, really excited about this. I am so picky with anything that I would consider putting in front of you. And I think this is a really good idea. And I won't take huge chunks of time to talk about it. But thanks in advance to all of you who've heard from for your supportiveness about that idea and your willingness to consider what the Samaritan Ministries thing is all about coming up. Cool. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.